Suddenly, the price of wheat in Liverpool and the rainfall in Madras were variables in the same vast equation of human survival.
Capitalism and democracy, capitalism and democracy are not synonymous. We group us up like ants in a colony, organize the wealth into a socialist economy, a way of life based off the common needs. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene.
Welcome to Subversive History, everybody. My name is Johnny. I'm a co-host of this rebranding of the Subversive History book podcasts, right? With me always is my co-host, Pat. And also with us and joining us for like the first official branding of the Subversive History book podcast cast is Philbo Schwaggins, and
Howdy,
they
y'all.
will also be acting as like, you know, our new producer to help us with the production of this because, you know, I'm flickering in and out of existence and Pat has a love-hate relationship with technology, but hopefully this improves us by light years in terms of being able to get you well-produced, informative, educational, entertaining, combination of edutainment book podcasts, right? That you can also find on patreon.com/subversive history. Yes, we will still be on the twitch.com/subversive history. Yes, you will still be able to find us on the YouTube at Subversive History. And, you know, we're still on Twitter at Subversive Hist 1.
There you go.
So,
And aside from all that, if you're just meeting us now, hi, welcome. If you are vaguely aware of our existence, we've been streaming on Twitch for like a year and a half. We were doing book presentations on Twitch. We decided that was probably not the most appropriate format for us to have these discussions on books. So we're moving it here to a podcast format. Yeah, I think
I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to be here.
Philbo, would you like to add anything? Sorry, yeah.
Not much. I am just really happy to be on board, help this project grow and hopefully reach more people and get this subversive history into the hands of the people.
There you go. So, with all of that out of the way, let's do what we came here to do, and that's talk about books. And we have a very, 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 very special book that we'll be discussing today. And when I say very special, I mean that in its legacy to like the history of leftist literature, as well as very special to my heart. It's a book that I read very early on in my process of political education. It's from I would say somewhat well-renowned author who did just pass away about 2 years ago. His name is Mike Davis, and we will be covering his book, Late Victorian Holocausts, which I have a copy of right here. I should have had it closer to me. So today we'll be kind of talking about who Mike Davis was. We'll be going into like the beginning of the book, the preface, and the first chapter, and we'll just have a discussion about that. I was thinking, before we actually get into the book itself, I think it would be good to have a discussion about who Mike Davis was as a person, because he lived a very interesting life. He lived a life that was very, maybe not what you would expect of a academic. I think he lived like a much more like interesting life. So I kind of wanted to detail a little bit of his life just so that everybody's acquainted with the man behind the book,
Yeah.
So just a little introduction on that. Mike Davis is an American political activist, urban theorist, and historian. He is known for several books, and I know several of them right here: Late Victorian Holocausts, Prisoners of the American Dream, and Buddha's Wagon are all the ones that I have personally. I know City of Courts is also another popular one that he has about L.A.
That's a fiction novel, right?
City of Courts, I'm not positive. That's one that I don't have and I haven't read. I know it's about Los Angeles, but I know he's written 2 fiction books as well as his nonfiction, like history books. But, for anybody that isn't really well versed in Mike Davis's life, I would really encourage them to maybe visit his Wikipedia page, because, like I said, he lives a life that is very, not expected for somebody of his academic stature. He's a very like salt of the earth kind of guy. He was born in 1946, and his parents were trade unionist, anti-racist Democrats, which, in 1946, actually, anti-racist Democrats is actually a very important, a very important caveat to have onto the title of Democrat in 1946. His father was a union meat cutter. He was raised in San Diego County. One of the early memories that he discusses is he was 9 years old, and he was in this cafe, and there was a bunch of pictures hung up of cadavers as they were described. And he was 9 years old, and he asked his father and the person working at the cafe what they were. And apparently they were all young Mexican men who had been executed at the border, shot in the back. And he said that from that moment, that had like an indelible effect and influence on him that influenced his view of the border, his view of nations, his view of politics, and things like that. So like he brings up like this specific, just seeing these photos as something that was deeply influential to him at 9 years old. At 12 years old, he witnessed the aftermath of the Pendergast murders, which were near his home, where 5 people, including 4 children, were murdered. And like more on this like weirdly like violent area that he was from. He was also personally bullied by a future mass murderer named Carl Eder, who would go on to shoot 6 people, go on the run, shoot another person, and then set himself on fire.
What?
In addition to like these like very extreme like things to witness as a young child, he says that he would frequently hear women and children being beaten while in his backyard. Like he'd be in his backyard and just hear domestic abuse like around, like it's one of these kind of like San Diego, like I imagine like desert towns of like, just kind of like sketchy desert towns,
sketchy desert
near the border somewhere. I mean, that's how I've
probably around the same time that like the movie Casino like takes place.
Yeah, exactly. So then like there's another pivotal moment of his life. At 16 years old, his father had a massive heart attack, which kind of took him out of commission in terms of working and providing for the family. So at 16 years old, Mike Davis stepped up and took on a delivery job to support his family. And he kind of just like went off the rails in a little bit of a depressive period at this point. And he described this time as he was just drinking, racing cars, and stealing cars with his friends. Like that was like his whole vibe when he was 16. And that culminated in a near fatal car accident that he was in when he drove his Ford into a brick wall during a drag race, which he still had permanent scarring from to the end of his life. So during this whole period, did you have?
He sounds pretty cool. Sounds like a pretty cool.
Yeah, dude. No, he sounds awesome. What? Like, this dude sounds like the coolest guy that ever lived. Like,
bro, it hasn't even started yet. Like honestly, like,
that's what I'm saying.
The real cool shit is like barely started. So he's drag racing, drinking. His father's like out of the picture, not out of the picture, like out of the picture in terms of like his health.
Right.
And then at this point, while he's like kind of living this like debaucherous lifestyle, probably that would lead him into an early grave or a jail cell of some kind, he meets an older gentleman who was a wobbly and a communist that he would hang out with regularly and drink wine with. And apparently at the end of every single one of these conversations, his new friend would advise him to read Marx. That was like the ending, the exclamation point of every conversation that he had with this guy. Like they would get together, drink some wine, and he would say, all right, Mike, have a good one, kid. Read Marx.
Reminds me of Parenti.
Advice.
Yeah.
Parenti, like in that one speech, it said how like, everybody's like, oh, this sounds a lot like Marx. This thing that like you're taking away from all of this stuff. Yeah. Sounds pretty Marxist. He's like, well, I've never read him, but like, it sounds like, he's got the right idea if you ask me.
Stealing my ideas. So now, following this period of him being, as he would describe, as alcoholic, a delinquent, and suicidal, that was his words to describe himself as a teenager, he got invited to a CORE demonstration. And Johnny, I don't know if you remember when we went over The Sword and the Shield by Peniel Joseph, there was kind of like, there was SNCC and there was CORE, there was these, civil rights groups. CORE was the Congress of Racial Equality. Well, Mike Davis's cousin was married to a black civil rights activist, and he was invited to this core demonstration. And while at the core demonstration, the entire group was doused in lighter fluid and threatened to be burned by a group of sailors. And apparently they were only rescued by the intervention of a group of Nation of Islam members.
What?
This is off his Wikipedia page. That he was invited to a cool demonstration with his cousin, who was dating a black civil rights activist, and like some sailors, who I imagine white sailors, came and doused them in lighter fluid, and it was only through the good-natured members of the Nation of Islam that they were rescued. And he described this moment, this occurred in 1962, as his burning bush moment, like, a very serious moment of revelation and radicalization. And he would remain a member of CORE, and he would remain a member of CORE, and he also went on to graduate as a valedictorian of his high school. So This dude is simultaneously getting drunk and drag racing and stealing cars while also like being like a young like I imagine there's not that many white dudes that are demonstrating with CORE at this point. That's just my guess. That's just my guess. This is 1962. Well,
to lift another statistic from, the great Peniel E. Joseph and their book, The Sword and the Shield, when we went over that statistic of like what was public opinion on like,
Martin Luther King as he was
the late, Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., right? Yeah. Like it was like 30% that were
he
like
deserved it.
He had it coming. So like, it actually is like quite shocking, and like all signs point to this being a very like different scenario for him.
Right. Well, I'm just saying, imagine, being that kind of like, rough and tumble kid, drinking and stealing cars and getting in accidents, and then also organizing with civil rights groups, and then also becoming valedictorian of your high school. Like, those are three things that like most teenagers are not doing individually, let alone at the same time.
Yeah, so I wasn't doing any of those things as a teenager. There's nowhere close to being valedictorian, I'll tell you that much. But nor was I like going out and partying or doing fun things.
Yeah, already a pretty impressive character here, even in his teenage years. So following high school, he would get a full scholarship to Reed College, but he would be later expelled for drinking and staying in his girlfriend's dorm. Like, you're not allowed to be like in a girl's dorm and stuff like that. So he gets kicked out of college that he just got a full ride to, and he hops a Greyhound bus to New York City. Once he's in New York City, he became one of the chief coordinators behind the anti-apartheid sit-in at Chase Manhattan Bank, who had just previously bailed out the apartheid government of South Africa following the Sharpeville massacre. So this sit-in had everything to do with this, like the way that the bank, it's almost like BDS. Well, I think it's like exactly like South Africa was the model for BDS prior to that. So it's like, he was like early on in the BDS trying to pressure Chase Manhattan Bank to stop funding the South African government while they're committing massacres.
Which is funny that like every detractor of BDS is like, oh, what's it really accomplishing? Or like, some like weird offshoot Trotskyist like organization saying like, you're hurting the workers of Israel. And it's like, like I'm serious. That's a real take.
Wild.
That's but wild. Like, this guy like sounds like he's right on the money. Like
we
almost every time.
We got a little bit more. In 1965, he would move back to California and continue his activist mission, protesting the construction of the 210 freeway through a historically black neighborhood. And then he burned his draft card after LBJ decided to intervene in the Dominican Republic. So like, I think the Marines occupied the Dominican Republic at this time, and he just burned his draft card right then and there in protest of that. In 1966, this is pretty wild. He would appear on the talk show of Melvin Belly, where he would debate the actor Kirk Douglas over the Vietnam War. I tried finding footage of this.
Hang on a second.
There's only like newspaper articles about this. But he debated Kirk Douglas. Johnny, do you remember what movie Kirk Douglas was in?
Wait. Kirk Douglas, the same Kirk Douglas from no, he's got to be the dad of the dude from.
Are you thinking about Michael Douglas?
I'm thinking about Michael Douglas.
Yeah, no. Kirk Douglas was in Paths of Glory.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
So this is
Yes.
an
Yes.
interesting full
Yes.
circle moment for us because we read Jacques R. Paul's book, The Great Class War, which kind of uses Paths of Glory as a literary tool.
Yeah.
And we watched the full movie on our stream one time. So during this debate, Kirk Douglas referred to Mike Davis, who was 19 years old at this time, by the way, a 19-year-old kid debating Kirk Douglas, who was just in a fucking Stanley Kubrick movie. Kirk Douglas referred to Davis as a commie dupe. You're a commie dupe. And Davis said he admired his appearance in Paths of Glory, but questioned why the actor would star in an anti-war film while serving as a goodwill ambassador for the Johnson administration in Southeast Asia. So
True. Yeah, Mike. Yeah.
Very good
Yeah.
point.
Good point, Mike. Yeah. Why did you do that? Like, why are you starring in like an there is no other message to take home from that film other than like war is fucking awful.
If I was Kirk Douglas, I would have been like, well, next time pay me to be in a pro-war movie and I'll do that too because I have no soul or actual, I really don't care what kind of movie I'm in.
I can be bought.
So he would continue organizing in South California and regularly participated in anti-war and civil rights protests, including picketing the Dow chemical plant in Torrance, California for their production of napalm for the Vietnam War. So this is actually something that's kind of going on today as well for Gaza, right? Where you have people protesting the places where they're either shipping or manufacturing the weapons that will inevitably end up.
Very recently, like protesters had busted into a factory, like an arms factory in England.
Yeah.
And busted up a bunch of computers and shit.
So it is like quite impressive to see, like, you know how there's so many people that like, as you go back in time, you have to like kind of like contextualize their shittier positions on certain things. You're like, oh, it was a long time ago. They just didn't know. It seems like Mike Davis was like as close to the money as you're going to get on a lot of things for the majority of his life that I can see.
Yeah.
So just to put a pin in this little summary of Mike Davis, an introduction to Mike Davis, he would go on to be a scholar at Getty Research Institute. He received the MacArthur Fellowship Award in 1998. He got the Lana Literary Award for nonfiction in 2007. He was Distinguished Professor Emeritus in the Department of Creative Writing at the University of California. And then he went to teach urban theory at the Southern California Institute of Architecture and at Stony Brook University before securing a position at the University of California Irvine's History Department. As a journalist, Davis has been featured in The Nation, New Left Review, and Jacobin. So that's like the end of, I just wanted everybody, as we're coming into this, maybe you're brand new to Mike Davis, maybe you're brand new to this book. I just wanted everybody to kind of know, like, the nature and the character of the person who wrote the words that we're going to be going through so intimately.
Yeah, I mean, like, I've always heard of him as like sort of one of the few like leftist authors that like was also equally like an activist, like somebody that was actually involved in organizing.
Oh yeah,
right. And put like his career and everything on the line. So I've always had like a deep felt respect for the work of Mike Davis, not just like in like his writing, but also like the organizing. Like he was committed to. I think he was also a Teamster too, right?
I wouldn't be. I didn't get to that part on his Wikipedia.
Right.
He might have been though. I wouldn't be surprised. So moving on, I kind of wanted to talk about the book a little bit. So, like I said, this is a book that I read very early on in my process of education. Probably one of the first 10 to 20 books I read when I was getting into like leftist literature, history from a leftist perspective, and this is like really like, like kind of like a milestone book for me, like a book that really like changed like the way that I viewed things of history and things of economics, because I kind of call this like the Black Book of capitalism. Like, how there's the Black Book of communism that says like 100 million people were killed in like X amount of time. And, there's these things that like
the hypothetical Nazi children that were like wiped away from existence.
Things like this, like before picking up this book, I didn't know that there was these famines that happened in India in the late 19th century. They're not talked about quite as much as other situations that have happened. And like this book was so enlightening to really kind of like dispel certain myths of like economic progress, myths about like benevolent colonialism and things like that. And, that's really, what I'm excited to discuss, is to be able to take these things that are kind of like cliches of like our modern era of capitalism that, life standard of living has just done nothing but gone up. It's been miraculous. Everything it touches, it's just so much more efficient. It's just so much more humane.
Why would people not want to join this great capitalist development?
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
And this
right.
book really, really kind of lays bare the issues with just taking those statements at face value. Aside from my own personal feelings about this book, which it is literally one of my favorite books of all time. If anybody asked me like, hey, what's a book I should read? This is pretty much one of the top 3 that I'm recommending to them. But I have some reviews here that I compiled. Late Victorian Holocaust won the World History Association Prize in 2002. It was featured in the LA Times Best Book of 2001 list. The publication New Scientist called it a masterly account of climactic, economic, and colonial history. And then also The Guardian had a pretty interesting take on it. In a Guardian review, they said, class may be passé in academic circles, yet the catalog of cruelty Davis has unearthed is jaw-dropping. A friend to whom I lent the book was reduced to tears by it. Late Victorian Holocaust is as ugly as it is compelling, but as Conrad's Marlowe said in Heart of Darkness, the conquest of the earth, which means the taking away from those who have a different complexion and slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look at it too much. So that's from The Guardian there, and quoting, the classic Joseph Conrad book, Heart of Darkness.
Which mirrors a very real life event
In the
for
Congo, in
people.
the Belgian
Yeah.
Congo. Yeah, it's based on the Belgian Congo. So, is there anything that you guys would like to add at this point, like about the book, about the author, before we get into the actual contents of the book?
I voted for this one on the Patreon, which is something that we can do regularly, because for me, it was like a lot of this stuff is kind of like, it's like noise information that like I know is there, but it's like very much in the background. It didn't have very much clarity. And so when I knew that this was like an option, I was excited that this was the one that eventually got picked, because it is going to fill in a lot of that kind of like, it's going to bring a lot of clarity to stuff that I kind of knew was there in the background, but hadn't had very much familiarity with it, like reading a book about it or whatever. I had a very similar experience reading about the early colonialization of like Central and South America. And so, I feel like it's going to be a similar kind of eye-opening process, to kind of really go into the details of it for the rest of the world where this book covers.
For me, every time we read one of these kinds of books, like when we read The Great Class War, or like pretty much like you can look at any of the books that we've read, any of them. And they provide such a context for the world that we live in today, because like the effects of these events, right? Like as we're going to read through this book, right? India, right? Or just like the subcontinent, right? Of that region was so keenly and profoundly like destroyed, and then like, kind of patchwork back together like a Frankenstein monster, right? That like we're gonna see, I think, like a lot of things that are happening today in India that are going to start to make sense, right? Or at least be given context, like as we go through this book. I believe that it also, stops its way through China as well, right? And I think that a lot of times we kind of like brush over what's referred to as like the century of humiliation, right? In terms of like a context for a lot of the things that would happen throughout like, World War II and afterwards. And I think that like this book is going to give us like an excellent like aerial view of like how and why things happen the way they did.
Right. 100%. And then like another thing that I think is like interesting is like, so many people know about the Holodomor, you know what I mean? And I think they know about it for good reason. It was absolutely catastrophic and a lot of people lost their lives, but Holodomor is almost like, a household name of like historic catastrophes. You know what I mean? Like, and I've honestly even tried looking up some of these things that are discussed in this book on YouTube, and it's like almost impossible to find any like real like video essays or like lectures about them. It's like they almost are like routing me towards the Holodomor. Like when I was like searching for this, it would be like, did you want this? This is kind of what you were looking for. It's like,
this is what you're looking for.
if you're someone out there that's like extremely critical of something like the Holodomor, then I think that you also owe it to yourself to read about this, because if you know about that so in so much detail, but you have no idea about certain things that happened in India and China during the golden age of enlightened liberal capitalism, I think you're doing yourself an injustice. So I kind of actually real quick, because we got a little bit ahead of ourselves, I want to like explain to anybody like what we're actually intending to do here. Like what this project is can be one of many things. Like maybe you're reading this book and you wanted like a companion in a way where like you read the chapter and then you can like hang out with us in an indirect way where we talk about it and we kind of like mess around and joke about it or talk or bring up certain extra pieces, extra trivias and stuff like that. Or if maybe you're just not quite a reader, maybe you have a hard time going through 400 pages of this book, but you also want to like know its contents and you're just more amenable to like a podcast. It's easier for you to learn that way. You can skip the book entirely and read this. I wouldn't recommend skipping the book. I would recommend reading it and then listening to us as like a companion, but whatever you're comfortable with, you know, I mean, I understand that, you know, reading full books is not really like for like every single person.
Yeah. Hey, and if you have Spotify and, you know, you're supporting like military contractors that way, you can listen to the audiobook on Spotify while you're reading it. And by the way, if you just search the title of this book, which you know, I'm whatever way you feel about it, right? If you put the letters
PDFs, there's like
put the letter PDF after it, like some interesting results may come up. But I also think that like, hey, you know, maybe support like the Mike Davis estate, you know, whatever way you can. Throwing that out there.
All right.
I recently started the audiobook and looking at the physical book for reading, and that was a huge game changer because it makes it go a lot faster, especially because I have lose focus, but I can feel like I can get through the information in a way that like my brain can keep up with and still make highlights and stuff. It was very crucial for me.
Oh yeah. Sooner or later, you're going to be listening to that thing at like 1.8 speed. You know, you're going to be reading like a champ.
Galaxy Brain. You'll have two of them on at once. Just two books.
Exactly.
Just two books
One
playing
simultaneously.
Yeah.
Exactly. You're going to be playing like, you know, City Jumper while reading with the two different audiobooks going on. You know, solving a Rubik's Cube with your feet. It'll happen. Trust me. You know, we're also going to be selling nootropics in the near future.
I just ordered the components for them. They should be at my house. I'm gonna
start bottling them in the bathtub.
I'm gonna start capsuling them in my downstairs bathroom. They should be available for purchase sometime next week.
Got a pill press.
Yeah. So, hey, look, if you're watching this, you have any questions, like, you know, feel free to leave us a comment, right? You know, like I said, we're also available on Twitch. We're also available on Twitter. We're, you know, get at us if you have any kind of questions or like, you know, there's something about the book that like, you know, you find, you know, pretty interesting. Let us know. We're always interested in like, you know, hearing from you. So thank you for your time.
All right, well, then let's get actually into the meat of this discussion and let's talk about this book that we're going to read. We're cracking it. It's fresh right now, page 1. We're talking about the preface. And Mike Davis makes an interesting, not interesting, like, you know, I think an interesting but also compelling introduction. It's like a narrative kind of introduction that follows Ulysses S. Grant. So Ulysses S. Grant, obviously, President of the United States, one of the main generals of the Civil War, from the Union.
Right. The War of Northern Aggression. Right.
Right. So following the end of his, finishing his presidency, he decided to go on this like world tour. It's him, his family. And he's also accompanied by this guy, John Russell Young, who's a journalist from the New York Herald. Johnny, do you remember the New York Herald from anything specific that we discussed?
I feel like there's like this weird, like, you know, lispy German guy that used to write a couple of articles for them every once in a while about like world events or something like that, you know?
Yeah, Marvin or something like that.
Marv.
No, that was Karl Marx. Karl Marx early in his life wrote for the New York Herald. So the same guy was working with them close to the same time, maybe like 20 years after Marx was writing for them. So it's Ulysses S. Grant. his wife Julia, his son Jesse, the first family, they plotted an itinerary that would have humbled Alexander the Great. They went up the Nile to the Thebes in Upper Egypt. I hope I said that right. Back to Palestine, then on to Italy and Spain, back to the Suez Canal, outward to Aden, India, Burma, Vietnam, China, and Japan, and finally across the Pacific to California. This is kind of like a hard thing to see here. This is like the map that they have of it. You can see the red line that goes across. This is the United States here in the middle, and he leaves from the east of the United States into Europe. You see the line kind of shoot all over Europe. Then he goes down through the Middle East into India, into China, and then back around, leaving Japan to go into California. So this is like a really rough outline of his world tour here.
Well, you see, Pat, golf had yet to rise in popularity. So, back then, if presidents wanted to just kind of avoid like doing anything, they could just kind of like, I'm going to fuck off to, Europe and Kerouac this shit. And, because there's no like, 18 hole like golf course in America yet for me to just spend 40 hours a week at.
So during this global escapade, he would meet with the likes of Queen Victoria, who, late Victorian Holocausts. Queen Victoria is pretty central to a lot of what we'll be discussing today. He met with Otto von Bismarck. He met with King Leopold II of Belgium, who is also infamous for colonial atrocities. He met Tsar Alexander II. And I do want to throw out here, he did this, he was all over Europe and meeting with all those people. There was one place there he was protested. Do you know what place that was?
No.
European country.
European country. It wasn't Italy, right?
No.
Okay.
France?
No.
Belgium.
Ireland.
Ah, you know what? That should have been the first guess.
Been the first one. When you say it, it seems very obvious.
Yeah, it's like, oh, it's right there. Yeah, of course the Irish are like, get the fuck out of here. Like,
so when Grant was president in 1876, he didn't accept the Fenian delegation advocacy for Irish independence.
And there it is.
They, were not too fond of old Grant. So, that was, kind of an itinerary of him in Europe. But then he leaves Europe and goes to Egypt. It starts with Egypt after Europe. And it's like at this point, the Grants were like confronted with scenes of famine and impoverishment they had like never particularly seen before in the United States and Europe. We have like, if you want to bring up like image number 3, it shows the Grants in Egypt. This is the Ulysses S. Grant and his family in Egypt. Yep, there it is. This one. See, it came up and then it got blurry like after. Like it looked good and then now it's less blurry. All right, well that's not too bad.
I think he's the guy in the white hat.
He's the guy in the middle. So, Young, the journalist from the New York Herald, wrote several things about what they saw while they were there. One thing he said, today the fields are parched and brown and cracked. The irrigation ditches are dry. You see stumps of the last season's crop, but with the exceptions of a few clusters of the castor bean and some weary, drooping date palms, the earth gives forth no fruit. A gust of sand blows over the plain and adds to the somberness of the scene. So they're there and they're seeing this like extremely dire environmental situation, like a period of drought that seems to be affecting the agriculture and through that affecting the livelihood of the people that live there. Young would go on further to say that the Englishmen look upon these people as his hewers of wood and drawers of water, whose duty is to work and to thank the Lord when they are not flogged. They only regard these monuments as reservoirs from which they can supply their own museums, and for that purpose they have plundered Egypt, just as Lord Elgin plundered Greece. So even just from this, like kind of like, coming from like an American perspective, which I'm sure they don't miss many punches, especially during this time to like talk shit about a British person or British people, Britain in general. But they got to Egypt and they seem to be not pulling any punches as being like, this is all the English's fault. The English have exploited these people. They steal things from their museums. They've plundered this country. And, this is, I imagine this is probably the time when they were building the Suez Canal. I would assume. Oh no, the Suez Canal must have already been built because they said that Mike Davis said that they took the Suez Canal, so that must have already been built. So you know that colonial influence is very pronounced in Egypt at this point.
Yeah, this is the English basically treating them as Domenico Lacerdo used the term throughout liberalism, bipedal machines.
Yes. I agree. Yeah, absolutely. They didn't look at them so much as humans, as more so the same way you look at either a horse that draws a carriage or a tractor itself or something like that. Like more something that's meant to be acquired for the purpose of manual labor rather than something that has its own intrinsic existence or value.
Right.
So then they move on from Egypt, and at this point they make it to India. One thing I'd like to throw out is that Ulysses S. Grant was accused of groping English ladies at dinner while he was drunk. That was an accusation that was levied to him during that time period. But also, while they were there, they saw more of this like really intense like drought situation, as well as people that are just seem to be extremely impoverished and famished. Is infamished a word?
Famished?
Famished is the word.
Famished.
Okay. Thank you, Philbo.
Famished.
And when Young brings this up, he says there is no despotism more absolute than the government of India, meaning the British government is what he's referring to there. Mighty irresponsible and cruel. Conscious that more than 5 million Indians had, by official count, had died of famine in the preceding years, Young emphasized that the money which England takes out of India every year is a serious drain upon the country and is among the causes of its poverty. So even, this guy who's a journalist and like alongside Ulysses S. Grant, he's really seeing like it, like he's not like it took like decades for this to be realized, like in some kind of like a widespread capacity that like, hey, this is the British, the colonial government's fault, as opposed to just like some like whoopsie of like environmental accident.
Why are these people just living in like these desperate like conditions? How did this happen?
Right, exactly. So then they go on to China. Philbo, if you want to bring up image 4, this is Ulysses S. Grant with the Emperor of China. And it's pretty funny, but accordingly, when they arrived in Shanghai, 100,000 people turned out to cheer the Grants, and a local band attempted to play John Brown's Body.
Nice.
Do you know what John Brown's Body is, the song?
John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. Moldering in the grave.
Moldering in the grave.
There's a great
They turn it into
version of
Solidarity
that.
Forever.
Yeah, and there's a version of it by Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson does a version of that. Yeah. So, as they were going from Tianjin to Beijing, the Americans were wearied by fierce, unrelenting heat, compounded by depressing scenery of hunger and desolation. 3 years of drought and famine in northern China, officially the most terrible disaster in 21 dynasties of Chinese history, had recently killed somewhere between 8 and 20 million people.
Wow.
So the worst disaster in 21 dynasties, not 21 years, 21 dynasties.
Dynasties are like kind of like they go for a while.
I played Dynasty Warriors when I was a kid.
Same dog. I
know what a dynasty is.
I always played as Zhou Tai, the guy with the samurai sword, right? Even though it's like totally not the period at all,
So yeah, and then they go on to say, an American consular official goes on to say that were it not for the possession of improved weapons, mobs of starving people might have caused a severe political disturbance, meaning that starving people may have just run down on their convoy there and stolen whatever was edible from them because these people are starving. So now it's kind of like on us, like we need to recognize a pattern that went unnoticed by the Grants, right?
Or like, was it unnoticed or was it just willfully disregarded? It's just like, oh my God, Mr. President, these people are starving. It's like, I don't see anything.
Yeah, but if you were just a regular white American, like, and you went to India and saw people starving, you're like, I don't know, yeah, this is just how people live over here. Probably, I just assume that I'm just rife with white supremacy and American exceptionalism. Like, I don't have to do too many mental gymnastics to try to figure out why this is happening. I'm white and they're not, so that's probably why. That's all I need to know at this point is probably as far as he thought about it.
Yeah, I mean there's that potential angle to it, but then there's like the journalists kind of recognize the
that's true. That's true.
The British were related to it, but it could also be one of those things of like you just mentioned American exceptionalism, where it's like, okay, well they're doing that, but that was what makes the British particularly evil, and that's why we don't like the British. But we're Americans, exactly. We're different. We don't do that. We're not doing that. And it's like the same thing that Zionists do today, where they're like, we're the most moral. Even though they're just another colonial project doing colonial massacres.
Right. Exactly. So, but what we're going to notice here is that Grant had visited these three, very somewhat distant, areas, the Indian subcontinent, the mass of the Chinese mainland, as well as Egypt. And all three of these places were experiencing almost simultaneously extreme weather conditions that were making agriculture and subsistence farming extremely difficult. And all three of these places also, coincidentally, were also colonized by the British. Well, maybe China, not in like a direct sense, but following the Opium Wars, there was like a level of like economic imperialism going on between.
There was an entanglement. All right. There was
an entanglement.
there was.
So, to quote David here, just to give a little bit more context to that, a disaster of truly planetary magnitude with drought and famine reported as well in Java, the Philippines, New Caledonia, Korea, Brazil, Southern Africa, and the Maghreb. So this is like he describes this as a planetary magnitude, a disaster of planetary magnitude. Like there's something very like big happening here that is like more than just each individual country. And this thing caused like wild and widespread mortality. So, Philbo, if you want to bring up image 5, this is like a estimated famine mortality table. So although only the roughest estimates of mortality could be made, it was horrifyingly clear that the million Irish dead in 1845 to 1847 had been multiplied by tens. So he's saying that like from 1845 to 1847, also British colony. Let's not forget that in terms of all these.
I think one could argue the first, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't know if they did that or Wales first or whatever, but yeah, definitely one of the first.
Scotland
could be Scotland.
One of those.
Yeah. So when a million Irish people had died in that, now we're looking at that multiplied by 10. So you can see here in what we brought up here. So this is India, the first part, and it talks about the famine of 1876 to 1879, and then again in 1896 to 1902, and that between the two of those, we're looking at between 12.2 to 29.3 million people dying in that 20-ish year period. Then you go lower, you see China from 1876 to 1879. It's the same dates for most of the relatively the same date period. China, you have between 19.5 and 30 million, so even more in both of the ranges in China. And then you also have Brazil here that has about 2 million in the periods that we're discussing. So we're seeing here like something that's like massive and potentially unprecedented. It's like, how is there this like widespread starvation in such extreme numbers happening essentially simultaneously in two different periods in multiple places of the world like that? And that's partly what we're going to be investigating here today through this book is like what are the environmental factors? What are the economic factors? What are the political factors that caused such immense mortality to occur in these places that did not see mortality in this extreme before this time period? It's not like droughts have never existed, but there's something going on. There's a different variable to these droughts that make them hit harder than they did before. Yeah. And that's what we're going to be talking about. I don't want to give it away.
I doubt that any of these droughts that they've experienced in the past, after let's say like thousands of years of like cultivation and societal development, right? That millions of people are dying, right? Every a couple generations or so. Not to mention, like, a lot of these numbers, like 12 to 29 million. And how much was the Irish famine
They
again?
said 1 million. I thought more people died in that than.
So let's just say conservatively, right? 1 million people died in the Irish famine. To this day, right? The Irish population has never recovered.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So you have to imagine that what that did to these populations as well.
Right. In terms of just like a sociological like examination, like what this amount of death did to these entire populations of people.
So just to discuss the situation like a little bit further, the Great Drought of 1876 to 1879 was only the first of 3 global subsistence crises in the second half of Queen Victoria's reign. It happened again in 1889 to 1991, where they were dry years that brought famine in India, Korea, Brazil, and Russia, although the worst suffering was in Ethiopia and Sudan, where perhaps 1/3 of the population died. Then in 1896 to 1902, the monsoons again repeatedly failed across the tropics and in northern China. Hugely destructive epidemics of malaria, bubonic plague, dysentery, smallpox, and cholera culled millions of victims from the ranks of the famine weakened. So if you're not already aware of this, it is important to know that famine deaths almost never occur as a result of just purely not having enough calories that your body can't function. Typically, when we talk about people that have died during a famine, it's that your body is weakened to a point that it can't fight off diseases. And then there will be massive outbreaks of these kinds of diseases that I just rattled off before that end up actually taking the lives of the many weakened, famished people. I almost said infamished again. I'm sorry.
Infamished. The infamished people of India.
So at this point, Mike Davis poses a question to us and the readers. How do we explain the fact that in the very half century when peacetime famine permanently disappeared from Western Europe, it increased so devastatingly throughout much of the colonial world? Let's just ruminate on that for a second. So simultaneously in Western Europe, peacetime famine effectively disappeared permanently at the same time period that we're seeing unprecedented devastation of famine in the colonial world. Should we chalk that up to coincidence, or could there potentially be some correlation between those two?
No. It's totally unrelated. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know why you're looking at that. I don't know, like, where you would jump to that conclusion.
It's the Milankovitch cycles. Okay, that's what causes the climate change. All right.
Well, actually, we're going to get deeper into that in one moment. Not that specifically, but to the actual climate part of this. So the next question is equally, how do we weigh smug claims about the life-saving benefits of steam transportation in modern grain markets when so many millions, especially in British India, died alongside railroad tracks or on the steps of grain depots? So I think we've all heard like the enlightened railroad systems of the colonial world, you know what I mean? That actually colonialism wasn't actually so bad because we gave railroads and other infrastructure.
Right. That's right. We modernized them.
Yeah. But according to this, there was millions who died alongside train tracks and at the steps of grain depots. So
is this like an electric train? Like there's that third rail. It's pretty dangerous. You know, a lot of times like people think I can just piss on this. And like,
you know, that could account for a lot of the millions of people that died.
Yeah, it's that third rail, man. It's dangerous.
All of them.
Probably all of them.
Probably all of them.
Yeah. It's like electric cars and electric trains are dangerous, all right? That's why we have to ban them, because they're just killing millions of people from time memorial.
So I think this next quote, I think, is like one of like my favorite quotes out of the entire book. Like if there's like a single like snippet quote that kind of like, in my opinion, like summarizes the theme of this book, it's this one right here. So he says, we're not dealing with the land of famine. Like kind of like saying that, like, you know, we're not dealing with just this like innately backward region where people just can't figure out how to feed themselves. So it's kind of like, oh, that's just the land of famine. People just can't get it together there. We're not just dealing with the land of famine, a becalmed and stagnant backwaters of world history, but with the fate of tropical humanity at the precise moment when its labor and products were being dynamically conscripted into the London-centered world economy. Millions died, not outside of the modern world system, but in the very process of being forcibly incorporated into its economic and political structures. They died in the golden age of liberal capitalism. Indeed, many were murdered, as we shall see, by the theological application of the sacred principles of Smith, Bentham, and Mill, meaning Adam Smith is the Smith they're referring to there. So, that kind of really lays it out as like, these people did not die despite the golden age of liberal capitalism. They were casualties of the very process of the economic incorporation of what we today call the third world into a Western Europe, at this point, London-centered world economy. In this preface, Davis goes on to state what is essentially like the thesis or the theme of the book, or at least what his intention is, like what he hopes to do. And that's to reveal that millions starved to death as a result of deliberate policy choices of the British, but also to pin names and faces to the human agents of such catastrophes, and also to consider the resistances, large and small, by which starving laborers and poor peasants attempted to foil the death sentence passed by grain speculators and colonial proconsuls. So he wants to obviously bring light to the atrocities. He wants to, name the individuals that caused such atrocities, and also, share some reverence to those that resisted these like brutal colonial policies.
Right.
He goes on to kind of explain the general thesis of the book, where he states, although crop failures and water shortages were of epic proportion, often the worst in centuries, there were almost always grain surpluses everywhere in the nation or empire that could have potentially rescued drought victims. Absolute scarcity was never the issue. And this is similar to the Irish potato famine, which some contemporaries would have you believe that it was just because of the potato blight, that, the potatoes all got rotten.
Just a natural disaster, man.
When in reality, they were exporting all the other edible food to Britain itself at the expense of the starving masses of Ireland. And that
also,
was only 20 years before. Go ahead, Phil.
Well, and also the potatoes themselves are not indigenous to Ireland. So that's a huge factor of the blight, was that it was not, the crops that they were growing weren't hardened off, or, they were susceptible to endemic,
Right.
I think it was I don't remember what the pest was. It was like a nematode or something like that.
If I remember things correctly, right. There are many varieties of potato.
That's exactly right. What you're about to say is right. Yeah.
The English are infamous for monocropping.
Exactly.
Right. So it was a very specific potato
and
that they were growing that was affected by a blight, whether it's a nematode or some kind of fungal infection or whatever. Regardless, right? The point is, this one species of potato that the entire population was forced to be reliant upon, right, was destroyed.
No, exactly. So Davis goes on to say that Smithian dogma and cold imperial self-interest allowed huge grain exports to England in the midst of horrendous starvation. The subjects of this book were ground to bits between the teeth of three massive and implacable cogwheels of modern history. In the first instance, there was the fatal meshing of extreme events between the world climate system and the late Victorian world economy. And this is one of my favorite. Suddenly, the price of wheat in Liverpool and the rainfall in Madras were variables in the same vast equation of human survival. So, this is the first time in world history where, the price of wheat in Liverpool somehow factors into the existence of a Deccan farmer in India. You know what I mean? Think about that. It's sorry, you know what I mean? Wheat's really expensive right now, so.
Right.
And he's like, I don't understand. I can just eat the food that I grow. And they're like, it doesn't work like that.
No.
Yeah.
This is somebody else's.
We have people today that think that they live in some kind of disconnected sort of patchwork, separate economies throughout the world. And it hasn't been that way in over a century, 2 centuries, some could argue, literally since the turn of colonialism and empire, right?
Yeah.
The average rainfall, right, in India does connect to whether or not some poor fuck in Liverpool has bread to eat for a month.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly what
The
we're talking about.
globalization didn't start with neoliberalism. It's kind of a feature of capitalism. Because you
Right,
don't have
absolutely.
like the beginning of capitalism without, you know, those initial phases of colonialism. So
Exactly.
Now we get into like the next discussion, which is like the natural part of this, because this is called El Nino famines, right? And
Mhm.
we've talked about, well, there's all this massive drought. Why are we trying to investigate the causes of famine? We've already kind of talked about, he even said it himself, these are the worst droughts in decades. Why are we, what is there to investigate at this point? There was a terrible drought. People died. Seems like case closed, right? Doesn't that seem like that would be sufficient enough answer? Well, Davis goes on to say, but what of nature's role in this bloody history? As we shall see, synchronous drought was one of the great scientific mysteries of the 19th century. So during this time period, it's like they didn't really know about these things like a synchronized drought throughout like multiple continents and things like that. Like science like hadn't really like discovered those kinds of patterns yet. However, there was that key breakthrough in the late 1960s when a UCLA scientist showed for the first time that the equatorial Pacific Ocean, acting as a planetary heat engine coupled to the trade winds, was able to affect rainfall patterns throughout the tropics and even in the temperate latitudes.
And what year did he figure this out?
This is the 1960s.
Oh, okay. I was about to say, I was like 18 something. Like, I was like,
yeah,
that dude must have been like the smartest guy on earth at that
Yeah,
time.
right.
Like,
So rapid warmings of the eastern tropical Pacific, for example, are associated with weak monsoons and synchronous drought throughout parts of Asia, Africa, and northeastern South America. These are known as El Nino events. If you want to bring up this El Nino, I tried like just bringing up some kind of like illustration of the El Nino situations. So I have this very in-depth map here.
so
that
where
shows
does the little boy factor
very-
into all of
This
this?
shows various wets and dries. You see here
It's like
see the
making
wets,
pasta.
see the
Yeah.
wets and the dries.
Yeah. You gotta get the wets, like, in the dries, and you gotta get the dries in order to have the wets.
Right. Exactly. So I'm not a meteorologist or anyone that is super knowledgeable on weather patterns or anything like that, but just wanted to show this as a little bit of an illustration of what we're talking about. But then later in 1986, there's further research on El Nino famines. And in 1986, two researchers working out of a national weather research laboratory in Colorado published a detailed comparison of meteorological data from both 1876 and the 1982 anomalies that identified first as a paradigmatic ENSO event, which is an El Nino event, perhaps the most powerful in 500 years. Similarly, the extraordinary succession of tropical droughts and monsoon failures in 1896, 1899, and 1902 were firmly correlated to El Nino warmings of the Eastern Pacific. So if you want to go to the next thing, it actually shows a comparison of these droughts, right? So that the darker bar on the left is 1877 to 1878, which is the first one we'll be reading about, and then one on the right is 1982 to 1983. Do you see how similar these patterns are, relatively speaking?
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
and just so you know, SSTA stands for sea surface temperature anomaly. So when there's like some like kind of anomaly of like temperature in the sea, that's what SSTA is referring to. But so you see here is like, there's these periods, they're called like El Nino periods, where there's this, they cause drought effectively, and they cause drought in like multiple continents. So we know that in this time period of 1877, that's what was occurring. And it's also what occurred later in 1982. So now like science has like kind of like discovered like really what this weather pattern is that causes these immense droughts.
Yeah. Just in time for the Atlantic Ocean to have the highest surface temperature year after year for like the last 5 years.
Yeah. I had no
Just
idea
every year's been record.
that the El Nino pattern was like kind of discovered, or understood scientifically this late in the game. Like, And it kind of makes sense, like why when I was a kid I remember hearing about it on the news, but not everyone.
Yeah.
It's still like not very well understood in the culture, and it's because it's like this very like really new concept for like I don't know modern humans or humans in general. Like this, hey, this is something that happens every once in a while. This like crazy interconnected like I don't know if crazy is probably the wrong word for it, but like this interconnected phenomenon that happens on Earth based on like ocean temperatures. And then yeah, when you factor in the climate change aspect of it and the oceans warming around the world, yeah, it probably
Yeah, at some point we got to factor in the microplastics.
seems
And
bad.
apparently, and this is getting way out of my depth on this too, but apparently there's like an inverse reaction called La Nina where there's immense
Yeah.
rains that come afterwards. It's like after like this period of immense like drought, there's like an inverse and opposite reaction that's called La Nina, which is a period of like a lot like heavy rains.
Yeah. I get my
Law of
weather from
equivalent
Ryan Hall,
exchange.
y'all. Oh, sorry.
What'd you say, Philbo?
So it's the law of equivalent exchange.
Yeah. Plus,
So-
you know, if you want like a primer on weather, watch Ryan Hall, y'all, on YouTube. He
Okay.
explains this.
I don't know what that is, but all right.
Okay,
It's like
I will check that out.
So this next is another one of those quotes that I feel like is really, really descriptive for the entirety of the book. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read that now. These great Victorian famines were forcing houses and accelerators of the very socioeconomic forces that ensured their occurrence in the first place. A key thesis of this book is that what we today call the third world is the outgrowth of income and wealth inequalities, the famous development gap, that were shaped most decisively in the last quarter of the 19th century, when the great non-European peasantries were initially integrated into the world economy. As other historians have recently pointed out, when the Bastille was being stormed, meaning during the French Revolution, the vertical class divisions inside the world's major societies were not recapitulated as dramatic income differences between societies. The differences in living standards, say between a French sans-culotte and a Deccan farmer, were relatively insignificant compared to the gulf that separated both from their ruling classes. By the end of Victoria's reign, however, the inequality of nations was as profound as the inequality of classes. Humanity had been irrevocably divided, and the famed prisoners of starvation, whom the International urged to arise, were as much modern inventions of the late Victorian world as electric lights, Maxim guns, and scientific racism. So like this is like such like in my opinion like a profound like paragraph here because it's talking about how like just go back to the French Revolution, which happened in the late 18th century, right? There was less of a disparity between each individual nation than there was between the lowest classes and like the monarchy, right? So essentially what they're saying is that the difference between India and France at that time, the difference between a regular French farmer and, you know, the monarchy of France was far more stark than just the difference between France as an entirety and India as an entirety. Like a random like subsistence farmer of France and India probably lived a very similar life in terms of like how much they ate, their general like health and things like that. But following this situation, we see not only class divisions between each individual country, but we see like deep fissures of divide between nations that didn't exist so much before that, before they were all integrated into this world economic system. And that the starving masses of these countries that we're going to talk about are actually inventions, modern inventions, just like that of the Maxim machine gun and scientific racism.
Nice. Like the Moab or like the you know, the VR headset or like the weather control machine.
Exactly. All of those things. Yeah.
Exactly.
It is really profound. Just because like, yeah, so many, because the part like what I mentioned earlier is like looking into how that happened in America and I guess in Europe also the enclosure movement and everything like that. Like
Right.
these are all like part of shifting, and then you kind of see that kind of happening. It reaches kind of like really its peak in this clear period of inequality between countries as like that those forces of accumulation have like really taken their toll on the places that they were operating on.
Exactly. Yeah. And we're actually going to talk more about the process of enclosure later in this book. They talk about the enclosure of like common lands of India, because having just like fully, just having like a fully
Like a common land for
privatized-
everybody to use.
Right. Well, no, I'm saying having a fully privatized like land, it's not like something that's historically been intuitive to people. Like, sure, maybe you own land, but there's like a bunch of land over there that's known as the commons, and anybody can really do anything on that. They can grow food on it. They can raise cattle.
It's like, no. That's also mine.
Right. Well,
No, I'm not over there, right? I don't go over there, but it's mine.
And I may not go over there for the rest of your life.
Right.
But really what it is like a lot of times those common lands were ways that helped people survive. Like
Right.
they may have to like work some farm for some people, but then they can grow subsistence crops over on the commons. And then when you close the commons, now the thing that they relied on for subsistence is no longer there. And you've pretty much either forced them into starvation or wage labor because they can't grow their own food anymore.
Well, and like, this is what I was getting into my thesis research on. It's like, it's even on a deeper level than that. Cause like, this is where they got their medicine from too. And so this is like, they were like deeply intertwined with their local ecologies, and they knew like every plant, and were able to like, and, you know, had a deep long working relationship with these like organisms, and the enclosure movement. And then, you know, how that played out externally through colonialism is like, you know, it and oftentimes was very explicit about like severing those connections to the land. That's why, you know, removing people from the land and moving them to somewhere else is an effective tool for ethnic cleansing, because those people, like, we don't have this as modern people because we live in a very like mechanized, you know, food system and medicine system where it like doesn't come from the plants surrounding us. But that's how it was for, you know, feudal peasants in Europe and, you know, indigenous peoples around the world. And that was why it was an effective tool of colonialization. Is like, well, we can sever every deep like tie you have to the land that you could live off of, then what else are you going to do?
Right. 100%.
Yeah, and famed transphobe Sylvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. Great book. You know, maybe a bad person as an author, but great book. The enclosure of the commons plays like a really big part in that whole like separating and degrading of like the peasantry, right, within Europe. And like, you know, that enclosure of the commons, like, you know, like you were talking about, destroyed like people's not just like ties to that land, right, but also just completely disrupted like their social ties, right, the social structure and fabric of like these smaller like, you know, villages and whatnot, right, and their cultural traditions that were maybe separate from whatever the nobility was practicing. But like the big thing in terms of like the you know, enclosure of the commons, right, is that diversity not just in culture and in practice of, you know, culture, right, but that diversity in ecology, right, because it's like, you know, who gives a shit about all these like fucking medicine flowers and fucking plants and all that shit? No, we're gonna fucking burn all this. You're going to grow pine, nothing but pine. Okay. Pine, tobacco, maybe, or like cotton. Can we grow cotton here? How about like corn, just nothing but fields of corn, wheat, right? Fuck all this other shit. Right. Like, who knows what could be out there? It's like, we do. Yeah. But like somebody that actually matters, you know, that can actually affect this decision. You're going to be growing cotton from now on.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I have one more thought on this. I know we want to move on, but it's the kind of on the flip side of that too. The part of the colonial process was like in the scientific categorization of plants and cataloging them was also a part of this like economic, you know, colonization of like what kind of things are out there that we can commodify. Rubber is a really clear example of this. That process is happening all over the world for a variety, you know, medicines, you name it. And like we even talk about that now today in modern society, and like, oh, save the rainforest, because who knows what kind of medicine we could be forcing to go extinct by, like, you know, but say nothing about the people that like still live there, you know, and who need the forest to be attacked so they can continue to live there like they have for generations and centuries.
Right.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so this is going to end the preface, and we're going to get into chapter 1 now, which is where we're going to finish today. We're going to go through chapter 1, and then we'll call it a day here on this installment of Subversive History. But so, chapter 1. As we start in chapter 1, we're going to first note that the Madras Observatory would record only 6.3 inches of precipitation for all of 1876, in contrast to the annual average of 27.6 inches during the previous decade. So when you take an entire decade and average it out, you're getting 27.6. That's, some years high, some years low, whatever, averages out to 27.6. In 1876, they got 6.3. That's,
Wow.
What is it? That's like almost 5 times. It's almost like 5 times less than the average. Which is an extremely, severe drought. So if you want to bring up the image number 8, it just kind of shows, like, I thought it'd just be helpful, like, because I don't know where Madras is necessarily. You just see the part of India that we're technically talking about here. This is like the area called the Deccan Plateau. It's this area that's kind of blue in the middle there, like this interior of like the southern central part of India. That's where we're really going to be talking about here for a second. So the worsening depression in world trade had been spreading misery and igniting discontent throughout cotton exporting districts of Deccan. So that's important to know here is that these are the cotton exporting districts where, just like both of you were just saying, is like what was traditionally land that was probably grown just to feed food, just for food of like the general village area or the general communal area, is now being forced into cotton production, not for personal consumption, but for not for personal consumption, but for export to market. That isn't even part of India. You know what I mean? Like it's going to go to the other side of the world for sale to make someone else money.
So for anybody that doesn't know or isn't aware, that region, right, that small region within India, I don't even know if you could characterize it as that. India's fucking huge is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, India is absolutely
that's a huge chunk of like the planet Earth that is just being used for cotton.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, what are they going to make their coats out of?
How many people in England are there to need that many coats?
Listen, man, coats are a hot commodity. Coats are a hot commodity these days.
How cold is it for that long?
So, and now, do you want to know the real messed up thing about all of this?
What?
So, although rice and wheat production in the rest of India had been above average for the past 3 years, much of the surplus had been exported to England.
Oh my God.
A troubled observer noted, it seems an anomaly that with her famines on hand, India is able to supply food to other parts of the world. Now, why don't you bring up number 9, image number 9 for me, and we're going to see an interesting picture here. Enhance.
Yeah.
It takes a second and it snaps in. Yeah. Well, you can't really read it. It's a little bit blurry, but what it says at the bottom there is grain bags on the Madras beach, February 1877. Those are all bags of grain that are set for shipment outside of India, outside of Madras, like the very epicenter of this like massive multi-million casualty starvation event.
Right. The one where like the children being eaten by dogs and like,
yes.
That horrifying like thing that literally like colonial whatever you call it, like some guy named Reginald is like his blood has been turned too cold to even write about like the true horrors that he has witnessed.
Right. So, and then let's talk about the railroads. You know what I mean? We were trying to investigate the railroads. There were other anomalies. The newly constructed railroads, which were lauded as institutional safeguards against famine, were instead used by merchants to ship grain inventories from outlying drought-stricken regions to central depots for hoarding, as well as being protected from rioters. Meaning like that, like, you know, even the colonial officials could see like, oh, the people are starving. Quick, get the grain into the depot because the rioters are going to get to it eventually soon enough. So that's how railroads were used. Because you might think that a railroad would be used as a really nifty modern way to, you know, proliferate food, diffuse food out into the starving areas, right? Like you could really use that kind of steam powered technology to really alleviate that, right? They did the opposite. They made sure they got it out of there so that the starving masses couldn't break in and eat it. So they were like very conscious of everything that was going on. Like this was not something that was like just like completely incidental. Like, oh, whoops, all the grain left and now we don't have any. It's
Whoopsies.
like, get it out of here.
So like the one thing that kind of struck me right throughout reading this chapter, right, that I don't even think Mike talked about that much is like what even was like the quality of life for people in England at this time? Because I feel like we've read other books.
If you read Frederick Engels has something about the working class in England, and like, you know, for the bottom level poor and factory workers and things like that, it was like a Charles Dickens novel. I think that's like precisely what like the time period, like when you say something is like Dickensian, like they're referring to this exact time period in England.
It's just like people are just like poor as shit, starving, like, you know, they're being put in like debtors' prisons and shit. Like they're selling their kids off to factories,
asylums, workhouses, everything like that. Yeah, things are really messed up at this point. And the streets are just like rancid with like rats and feces. And like if you went to like a London like slum in that time period, it was. And this is kind of like what we were saying. Like what Mike Davis was just saying is like the lowest level of existence between like. I mean, honestly, you might have been better off just being a subsistence farmer in India than living in like the slums of London at that time, like,
right.
Like, you know what I mean? Like as a poor in that area. So, but I mean, I would imagine that much of this export and commerce wasn't to benefit those people. It was to benefit the upper stratum of England at that point. So they could become more grossly.
I'm trying to understand, like, where is all of this fucking grain going?
Yeah.
If it's not even going to like the English people. You know what I mean?
It's going to be sold.
To then who? I guess that's even like, what's wild too. It's listen. It's only going to get sold, and so the people that are like in England who can't afford it, you know, it's like literally the same kind of situation we live in now, where there's an abundance of food, and a lot of it is coming from the global south. It's being shipped up into the United States, and it's being held in a commodity form
and then it goes bad, and it goes into a dumpster that they dump like
right.
Like
or like they like dump like bleach so that like, you know, nobody
can't get it. So,
it's like I'm reminded of like during COVID where it's just like, oh, the prices of potatoes and the prices of milk and eggs are going too low. We gotta like just find a big empty parking lot, start dumping the milk out into the hot fucking sun on the tarmac. Fucking get rid of it.
So, okay. So, and then this is actually, let's talk more about that, because like what we're talking about at the drought here, we've already established, we're not talking about just that there's not enough food. We've already established that there is food, but now there's this new thing like that happens as a result of this new capitalistic commodified concept of agriculture that's being forced upon these people. And that's what happens. So like, this is like a rule of capitalism, right? What happens when there's scarcity of something? When a commodity becomes scarce, what happens to it?
It becomes expensive.
Exactly. So like now, not only is it being exported out, but that which is there you like can't even buy. Dude, I'm trying to imagine what it's like maybe you're like a 50-year-old Indian person at this time, right? And maybe for like the first half of your life, you like grew food, you ate a lot of it, you traded some of it, you sold some of it to like probably people around you that also have things. And then out of nowhere, some British guy is like, we're taking all this. And you're like, why? To sell it. Okay.
Says who?
But I'm hungry.
I've been here for generations. Like, what are you talking about?
Some English guy's like, sir, you work for a wage. You have to buy the food. And he's like, okay, I'll buy the food. And they're like, how much is it? And they're like 10 times more than you make in a week. And he's like, I have a farm. Like, I don't know.
I grow the food.
I've been growing I've been growing this for like 50 years. And they're like, you just don't understand economics. You should read a book, Economics
You-
101, sweetie, because you just don't understand how this works.
This book is
Listen,
in
sweetie, it's
English.
basic economics.
It's called
I read a written language that's like older than your entire civilization.
So as a result, food prices soared out of the reach of outcast laborers, displaced weavers, sharecroppers, and poor peasants. The dearth, as the 19th century pointed out a few months later, was one of money and labor rather than food. So it's not even so much about food, it's about they can't afford the food at a skyrocketing price during the drought. Like, so they're even recognizing that it's not just about food. Philbo, can you bring up image 10? This is actually going to really illustrate this situation as well, because as we know, this drought occurred from 1876 through 1878. Now, sorry, I just burped and that's messed up. But do you notice? Johnny? Can you maybe like point out like a little bit of like? Can you notice any kind of like a trend or like a pattern? Not necessarily a pattern, but just what this looks like in terms of wheat exports.
One of the thousands of quarters is 420.
That's pretty sick, right?
That's
420 blaze it, man.
But in like the absolute
Get your
height
lighters up.
of the famine, which is 1877.
Oh yeah, no, that's like 1409. That's like way higher. That's like
It's the only four-digit number.
huge-
It's the only four-digit number out of that out of those 4 years, and it's at the height of the famine in 1877.
It really
And that's
skyrockets
exports.
up.
Those are exports to the UK specifically. So yeah.
Wow.
So let's talk about some of the individuals that maybe we can say were responsible for such things that happened here. If you want to bring up image 11, this is an individual named Lord Lytton, who
this is my guy.
this is the Viceroy of India at this time of the famine. And he, as according to Mike Davis, vehemently opposed efforts to stockpile grain or otherwise interfere with market forces.
I think you're doing him a disservice in not mentioning his illustrious writing career, right?
If you knew there's you see a book goes in a way where you start at one place and then it follows through a story. So like that part comes when it comes. Is there something that you'd like to put it? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, like, dude, not many writers, right, who write under a pseudonym, right, have their own dads come out and be like, you're plagiarizing.
Yeah.
You're fucking plagiarizing.
Yes, he was accused of plagiarism by his
Now,
own father.
whether that had anything to do with like the opium habit is debatable. All right. But like, I think the most important factoid about his illustrious writing career is that Queen Victoria very much liked his long, meandering, prose and poems that went nowhere.
Exactly. So let's talk about kind of what he was doing in India, though, because how I already said that he refused to stockpile grain for famine relief because it would interfere with market forces.
Yeah.
Well, also, he had a special little project going on in 1876, which is the year that the famine began. All through the autumn of 1876, while the vital kharif crop was withering in the fields of southern India, Lytton had been absorbed by organizing the immense imperial assemblage to Delhi to proclaim Victoria the Empress of India. Philbo, can you bring up the next one? I guess it's number 12. It should say Imperial. Yes. Okay. So this is what he was building at this time period when the famine was raging on. The Times of England, a correspondent wrote about this situation that the Viceroy seemed to have made the tales of Arabian fiction true. Nothing was too rich, nothing too costly. Lytton put on a spectacle, adds one of his biographers, which achieved the two criteria Salisbury had set him 6 months earlier, of being gaudy enough to impress the Orientals, and furthermore, a pageant which hid the nakedness of the sword on which we rely on. Its climactic ceremonial included a week-long feast for 68,000 officials, satraps, and Marathas, the most colossal and expensive meal in world history.
World history.
An English journalist later estimated that 100,000 of the Queen Empress's subjects starved to death in Madras and Mysore in the course of Lytton's spectacular Durbar. And that's why Indians of future generations would call him the Indian Nero. Not Indian Nero, but, you know, the Nero of India.
He's not like from India, Indian Nero, but he's like the Nero of India.
That's some wild decadence, like,
yes,
and
it's
yeah,
like
just
the
to have
most
it
decadent.
contrasted with everything else that we've already talked about is just like, it's just like the profound cruelty of it all. Like that's what keeps striking me. You know, what we talked about before with the grain exports, and then this again. It's just like this, like, and like what you said earlier, Pat. Like people are choosing to do this. This is not like
Right.
just like something that's happening. This is like conscious choices.
Exactly. And you know what I mean? Like that's the thing is like they might look back on these things in history books and call them like, oh, what a tragedy that was, you know, when the weather got bad, those poor souls who starved to death. But in reality, you're exporting record amounts of grain and also doing this like wild, decadent show of wealth. The whole reason they're doing this too is to ordain Queen Elizabeth as the Empress of India. So like some like, you know,
this is like a sweet 16 for
exactly
the Empress
exactly
of England.
To a bunch of like starving peasants that like they pull out and they're like, look, that's your queen, that's your empress, and they're like, I have, like, you know what I mean? Like
this is the kind of stuff that they put in fiction to show like this is like a really evil bad person.
This is like,
you know.
This is like
this is the Lannisters, all right.
Yeah,
this is who
like
they are.
This is like Joffrey in Game of Thrones. It's like
kind of heavy-handed, you know, narratively speaking. Yeah, like it's kind of like we get it. Like they're the bad guys, you know. Like
should we tone this down a little bit?
Yeah, if you wrote this into a work of fiction, somebody might be like, it's a little on the nose with this guy, right? Like you know what I mean?
Like we get it. They're the villain, all right. Like
you have to give him some kind of character development where he has like a redeeming quality or something, and it's like no,
exactly.
Actually,
no, she's just, you know, a callous, just a callous, evil woman. So like, you know, there was like a couple things that I think got like sort of name dropped a little bit, like the whole Malthus or Malthusian thought, right? Along with the social Darwinism that kind of accentuated that Malthusian like train of thought. I kind of wish that Mike had gone a little bit deeper into that, because I still think that like the best book that kind of like, without it being like a long sort of overarching thing, was definitely The Great Class War by Jacques R. Pauls. Mm-hmm. I think he went over like, you know, what Malthus and Malthusian thought and its influence was like pretty good, along with like the social Darwinism that gets mentioned by Mike Davis that kind of accentuates that in this period, because Malthusianism is like a little older, right? But social Darwinism is pretty like a recent development, right? But like, you know, there's also Liberalism by Domenico Lacerdo, that like that whole book is just basically like a condemnation of like the kind of these very conservative, very like, you know, kind of,
but it's liberal. Be careful when you say
right.
Like lexicon, conservative and liberal are two diametrically opposed things to a lot of people.
Right. In today's thought, yes, but like the conservatism that exists today is an outgrowth of the same liberalism. It's the same thing, right?
If you go to Thomas Malthus's Wikipedia page, it literally says like liberal, like from the like
liberal just train of thought or school of philosophy or whatever. Yeah. But like Malthus's whole shtick is like, poor people deserve to die.
This article is part of a series on liberalism in the United Kingdom. Is what it says. Is what it says on his. It says that on his Wikipedia.
Well, I think, you know,
on liberalism.
To kind of refer back to the liberalism book, and like it is specifically referring to like the idea of markets and things like that as like a key feature of organizing economies, because, you know, like the feudal societies, you know, a lot of that the economy was more or less in control of the monarchy, and whenever the monarchy needed the funds. And that was kind of the whole argument in the Enlightenment of like, we need to do something different. And the way forward in this like freer society is like free markets. And that's
free.
why. Yeah, free markets.
Free, air quote. Free. Invisible hand air quote. Free.
Yeah. Well, and just to summarize this point for anybody that isn't really familiar with like Malthus or Malthusianism or anything like that, is really what this comes, and this is really where the term laissez-faire comes from. I remember being in school learning laissez-faire, and like it's like teachers are like, that's just when you let the economy do its thing and you don't really mess with it or anything like that. And actually it's like kind of like has far more sinister applications in the many times that it's been evoked throughout history. And one of these is the Irish potato famine, where like, British officials like said like, hey, we could send some of that food back. And they're like, really, it's a matter of overpopulation. Malthus and overpopulation are like two.
They deserve it, really.
Like a pseudoscience of like this understanding of like overpopulation, where not only should you not interfere, but actually to interfere is to perpetuate their symptom of poverty in a way, where it's like, really the problem over there in Ireland and India is that those people have bred too much. They've bred past their capacity for that environment. And
too many children. They're just having too many children. We just have to let them starve and let the problem sort itself out.
Exactly. If we go over there and give them food, we're only going to perpetuate this, and we're just going to have the same problem. So actually, we're helping them by letting a third of them die, because if a third of them die, they're not going to be overpopulated anymore. This is
right.
Like
these same people are like watching like a dog pick clean like the rib cage of a fucking child in like the fucking street, and are just like the circle of life.
Meanwhile, they are engaged in the most like unnatural form of like rugged commodification. So it's like, it's funny that like it's such a hypocritical and contradictory way of thinking, because it's like you're using all these like modern means of like production and modern Enlightenment, concepts of political economy and all these things, but then it's like, no, but you can't give. You can't give.
Only take.
Taking is fine. That's the natural order of things.
Right. If we give, it's in a way so that we can take. It's like,
so Philbo,
we're giving them a railroad so we can take more faster.
That is why they had the railroad. If you want to bring up the next, there's Lighten again. Just in this point, he's just surrounded by,
He looks so like, enthused by this.
Yeah, he just doesn't really give a shit. He doesn't really.
He's chasing that dragon, man. That's what he's thinking about right now. He's just like, take this fucking photo.
So, they called him the poet in this one.
While this is up, he was a poet.
Yeah.
Johnny,
not a good one, but he was a poet.
I'm going to read this part for you, okay?
Okay.
It's widely suspected that the new viceroy's judgment was addled by opium and incipient insanity. Since a nervous breakdown in 1868, Leighton had repeatedly exhibited wild swings between megalomania and self-lacerating despair.
Oh my God.
So that's like, so
he was like self-harming. I mean, that's what they mean by self-lettering. Like he's literally cutting himself. Like that's what that's what he's saying.
That's what self-lacerating is, right?
That's self-harm.
That's how I interpret it.
Yeah, it's a fancy way of saying self-harm. He's just
I mean, like, not to like make light of like, people's like mental health crises, it's self-harm is a very serious thing, and if you are having feelings of harming yourself and you live in the US, please dial 988, right? If you're having like issues. I don't know, but like this dude, like I would not want like the dude that's like running like probably the most important operation, right, in like the English hemisphere of things. Like that's the other thing, is that like people don't understand how important India was to the English Empire. I think they don't get the true scope that like without plundering India of like every single fucking colorful rock, right, within its borders, right, they would not have been able to afford like the fucking
industrialization of their country,
or the genocidal, like, fucking haphazard project that was like, colonizing Australia. Like it was seriously, the entire thing was funded by plundering India.
So speaking of plundering India, and we had already talked about laissez-faire and Malthus, I want to read these couple quotes here that regard that out of the book. So, in adopting a strict laissez-faire approach to famine, Lytton, demented or not, could claim to be extravagance's greatest enemy. He clearly conceived himself to be standing on the shoulders of giants, or at least the authority of Adam Smith. Thus, the viceroy was only repeating orthodox curriculum. He was not some like kind of like villain, or like, I mean, he was a villain, but he was not an unusual.
He wasn't an exceptional villain.
Exactly. He was just doing what was very common. Like, think about this. The potato famine was only 20 years before this. Like, this is like standard at this point. He's like, what do you mean about famine? Yeah. We did this before in Ireland. You know what I mean? We already know how this goes. You let a bunch of them die and then whatever. you take food. So
like they're not people.
Right. This is an actual quote from him. There is to be no interference of any kind on the part of the government with the object of reducing the price of food. He then also said that efforts to give famine relief were humanitarian hysterics. He regarded them as hysterical. By official dictate, India, like Ireland before it, had become a utilitarian laboratory where millions of lives were wagered against dogmatic faith in omnipotent markets, overcoming the inconvenience of dearth. Grain merchants, in fact, preferred to export a record 6.4 million CWT of wheat to Europe in 1877 to 1878 rather than relieve starvation in India. So record exports were leaving India so
like more than ever before.
The grim doctrines of Thomas Malthus still had held great sway over the white Rajas. I guess it's Rajas, right? It would be Rajas.
I assume.
I want to pronounce the J silent, like it's like in Latin America or something like that.
Rajas.
Malthus.
Come to India. Stop. Please cut that.
Nope, that stays.
Malthusian principles, updated by social Darwinism, were regularly invoked to legitimize Indian famine policy at home in England. Lytton, who justified his stringencies to the Legislative Council in 1877 by arguing that the Indian population has a tendency to increase more rapidly than the food it raises from the soil. So again, this is just like similar things that were being said by Malthus, things that were being said about Ireland. He's saying, it's not a problem with the food. They're breeding too much. They breed like rabbits. They overbreed. They can't. There's not enough food, and this is what happens. This is what he was saying back to England.
Look, if there's not enough food after what we take out of there for the rest of the population, I think that's their fault.
Right. Well, here it gets really messed up. This is me quoting him again. Every benevolent attempt made to mitigate the effects of famine and defective sanitation serves but to enhance the evils resulting from overpopulation.
Right.
So any attempt to help is really just enhancing the evils of overpopulation.
Right.
So if we clean up the water, they won't die as much. And then, what are we actually doing here? That's
right. We're just, you know what? Sometimes you got to let the kids stick the fork in the fucking, electrical outlet. How else are they going to learn?
No. It's for their immune system. You let the kid go out and play in the dirt a little bit. And,
let him eat the sand. All right.
I mean, I know that you're like joking, but that literally is like the social Darwinism of the whole Malthusian argument is like, and like why they were saying this is like, oh, if, the strong ones will survive this lack of food in the environment that, just somehow happened to be that way. And they're like, conveniently ignoring the fact that they're like literally shipping it out.
Yeah. So then an 1881 report concluded that 80% of the famine mortality were drawn from the poorest 20% of the population. And if such deaths were prevented, this stratum of the population would still be unable to adopt prudential restraint. Thus, if the government spent more of its revenue on famine relief, an even larger portion of the population would become penurious. So now what they're saying is like, hey, a lot of people died, but guess what? 80% of the people that died were from the 20% poorest population. So it's like, you know what I mean? Like they're trying to say that like, it's actually kind of a good thing when you think about it.
Less poor people.
Income equality is going down.
Exactly. It comes across yeah, exactly. So like that's like legit what this 1881 report is saying is like 80% of the famine mortality were drawn from the 20 poorest of the population. And if we saved them, honestly, more of the population would just become poor because,
How else are we going to strengthen the middle class, Pat?
also, I'd like to point out that Leighton denounced these famine relief efforts as species of international communism, and that the idea that a rich Britain should consent to penalize her trade for the sake of a poor India. He denounced those ideas. So, like, it's funny that even back in the 1870s, he's like, that's just communism, really, what you're describing to me right now. Frankly, I don't like what you're bringing to me right now because it sounds like you're talking about communism. You want
Mind you, like the Soviet Union is still like 50 years away from even being a thing.
Marx has barely written like, like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't even know if like people like have like read.
I think Marx is still like a young Hegelian getting drunk in a bar. Like
not in 1870. No, not.
Okay, yeah, no, you're right.
He was towards the end of his life at this point.
He might even be dead by now. I think
he might have died by then, but yeah. So then there was a final. Okay, go ahead, Phil.
I was just saying it really is a testament, though, just of like the whole socialist movement of the time, because like, Marx was definitely a part of it, but to even have someone at that level, because this was like pre-World War I and everything like that. So like it really hadn't kind of hit.
I think this is actually I think this is the pre-Paris Commune. No, maybe
it's like
actually that might be why he's
simultaneous.
I bet you that's why he's saying it. The Paris Commune was in 1871. The Paris Commune was just 5 years before this. I bet you that's still hot on his mind.
So this is like when socialism was really widespread, but it was kind of like pre-Marx as like the, I don't know, quote unquote figurehead, if you will, of like socialism, and like where everyone was like turn to Marx as like the main originator of theory for socialism. But
you still had this time probably still had like
he was like
you probably still had like a dozen other people that were like considered big names in socialism, and Marx was just one of them.
Right. All right. So then there is a final report, the Famine Commission of 1878 to 1880, approvingly underscored Lord Leighton's skinflint reasoning. This is what the Famine Commission said. The doctrine that in time of famine, the poor are entitled to demand relief would probably lead to the doctrine that they are entitled to such relief at all times. And thus, the foundation would be laid of a system of general poor relief, which we cannot contemplate without serious apprehension. So like now they're saying like, yes, but if we give them food now, they're going to think they're entitled to the food whenever.
Right.
It's not
good. It makes us feel weird.
It makes us feel weird. Where it really feels like they're talking about like a cat or something like that, where they're like, you can't feed them every time they ask for food.
Right.
Then they're just going to ask for food all the time.
You're just going to train them.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and then there's a horrified British journalist that does. Okay, now we're getting into like a different vibe of things. Now we're going to talk about like this really kind of like messed up concept of like relief, where they have these like what are effectively labor camps to like try to help people to help people work for wages. So it actually gets like the starvation itself and the disease is very grotesque, but this is almost worse in a way. So a horrified British journalist discovered that they turned away anyone who's too starved to undertake coolie labor. I know coolie is somewhat of an antiquated term, but this is the quotations of the book. But even, and this is a quote, the labor test imposed upon the able-bodied is found to be too heavy for their famished frames. The wages paid are inadequately low, and in many districts, all who are willing to work do not find employment. No arrangements have been made to preserve the cattle by providing fodder or pasture lands. No grain stores have been collected or charity houses opened for the infirm and the aged. So now let's we'll get more into this as we get to Sir Richard Temple. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but widespread unemployment and the high price of grain, meanwhile, brought the specter of hunger even to the districts where rainfall had been adequate. So it's like there's this rippling effect where it's not even about drought and it's not even about food, because the price of grain has skyrocketed, and with it unemployment, that now like that even affects the places where there is rainfall and there is more adequate crops, because now there's just a like universal spike in grain prices.
Yeah.
So
which it like it seems like part of the apprehension and the things that they're the remedies that he doesn't quite specifically say that in the quote, but it's like price controls. It's like something that immediately comes to mind, where it's like we're just gonna say, okay, no one can sell above this, and like it's like something so small as that. Not that you can't export it, not that you can't like make money off of it, but just that you can't make literally as much money as you fucking possibly could.
Right.
Is what they're
exactly.
so worried about. Like,
these
it's just
people would still be
wild.
very rich. They would still be very rich. You know what I mean? If they, if they gave some famine relief, they would still be quite rich. So now we're going to introduce Leighton's kind of like right-hand man. This is Sir Richard Temple. Philbo, do you want to bring up Richard Temple? It should be like image 14. There he is. There's that guy. So Sir Richard Temple was the famine delegate. He was appointed famine delegate by Lytton to clamp down on the out-of-control expenditures that threatened the financing of the planned invasion of Afghanistan. By the way, not only was Lord Lytton really into this whole like imperial assemblage thing for Queen Victoria, but also he had been plotting on Afghanistan the whole time. And I'm pretty sure this is the quagmire that Britain got into that gave Afghanistan the title of Graveyard of Empires, because I don't think Britain were able to do what they wanted to do in Afghanistan. I'm not
Is that the Great Game? Is that what I'm thinking of?
The documentary, like it's like a 3-part YouTube documentary. I maybe all I know is that there was like this like failed British excursion into Afghanistan at this time, and I think that's what he's trying to. He's worried about taking money from that invasion, that next colonial invasion, to help the starving people that he has starved.
What about second invasions? We've had first invasions.
Well,
what about second?
Help the poors, but we are trying to invade Afghanistan, so I don't really know. What should we do here?
So this guy Temple is a really like, he's like an exceptionally like spineless character in this whole thing. Because I want to talk about why he's so fucking spineless and detestable. And that's because Temple was a shrewd choice as Lytton's enforcer. In 1873 to 1874, so this is just a couple years prior, he had followed Salisbury's urgings and dealt very aggressively with a drought that severely damaged the harvest throughout most of Bengal and Berar, meaning he actually helped the people. He imported 500,000 tons of rice from Burma. He provided life-saving subsistence, both relief works and a gratuitous dole, which forestalled mass mortality. Indeed, the official record claimed only 23 people starved to death during that issue. This guy saved millions of people's lives by he provided life-saving subsistence through importing 500,000 tons of rice from Burma. Because, you know, Burma was also colonized at this time by England. I think that's where Orwell served as a colonial officer, was in Burma.
I believe you are correct.
So they have, you know, a whole other colony over in Burma. So they're like, all right, let's bring in some rice from there. We'll help the starving people. This guy did that, right? This guy did that.
Wow.
Temple came under withering fire from London for the extravagance of allowing the scale of wages paid at relief works to be determined by the daily food needs of the laborer and the prevailing food prices in the market, rather than by the amount the government could afford to spend for the purpose. In public, he was lambasted by The Economist for encouraging indolent Indians to believe that it is the duty of the government to keep them alive. Senior civil servants convinced him that it was a mistake to spend so much money to save a lot of black fellows. That's, I guess, what they referred to Indian people at that point. And they denounced the relief campaign as pure forayism. Temple's career was almost ruined as a result of this. So what do you think he decides to do next?
Not like, you know, maybe
not
give
do food things.
Give food. Give food.
Okay.
Johnny believes in the guy.
Let's just take an excerpt out of the Times of London, that say, Sir Richard Temple, whether rightly or wrongly, has the reputation of having a mind so plastic and principles so facile that he can in a moment change front and adopt
Shots fired.
change front and adopt most contradictory lines of policy. His course in the famine districts certainly seems to bear this out, for he is even more strict than the supreme government in enforcing a policy which differs in every respect from that which he himself practiced in Berar 3 years ago. So he's
Wild.
He helped save millions of people alive, and he was chastised. Like the Economist was talking shit about this guy in their fucking magazine, and then he was like, "All right, you want it? You
I'll
want it? You
show
want it like
you."
that? I'll show everybody." Temple's brief from the Council of India left no ambiguity about the government's true priorities. The task of saving life, irrespective of cost, is one which is beyond our power to undertake. The embarrassment of debt and weight of taxation, consequent on the expense thereby involved, would soon become more fatal than the famine itself.
I just want to quote Lenin real quick that I believe it was him that said that the Economist in 1915 was a journal that speaks for British millionaires, and additionally stated that it held a bourgeois pacifist position and supported peace out of fear of revolution.
Based on this example that we're looking at, he's right on the fucking money. He's not wrong at all. But this guy literally said the embarrassment of debt and the weight of taxation would be more fatal than the famine itself. The embarrassment of the debt is worse than the famine.
Wow.
That's what he said in his own words.
He seems like a great person.
Oh, dude.
Oh, yeah.
He's totally chill. So in a lightning tour of the famished countryside of the Eastern Deccan, Temple purged 500,000 people from relief work and moved Madras to follow Bombay's precedent of requiring starving applicants to travel to dormitory camps outside their locality for coolie labor on railroad and canal projects. The deliberately cruel distance test refused work to able-bodied adults and older children within a 10-mile radius of their homes. It was certified that they had become indigent, destitute, and capable of only a modicum of labor. So he said, okay, if people want relief, they can go to these camps and they can work on our railroads and canal projects. And if they're not fit to work, they're not.
They're not fit to live.
Yeah, exactly. Temple cut rations for the male coolies, whom he compared to a school full of refractory children, down to 1 pound of rice per diem, despite medical testimony that the once strapping fine fellows were now little more than animated skeletons, utterly unfit for any work. Noting felons traditionally receive 2 pounds of rice per day, one district official suggested that it would be better to shoot down the wretches than to prolong their misery in the way proposed. So he's like referring to these like people trying to work to barely survive on like a pound of rice a day as refractory children. In the event, this became known as the Temple wage, provided less sustenance for hard labor than the diet inside the infamous Buchenwald concentration camp, and less than half of the modern caloric standard recommended for adult males by the Indian government. Philbo, can you bring up number 15? It's a comparison of cut calories. So you can see here the base metabolic necessity for an adult with no activity is, can you make this big?
Oh,
Big.
Make big screen.
Big. That's 1,500 calories for no activity. The Temple ration in Madras was 1,627 with heavy labor. Buchenwald, which was a Nazi concentration camp, gave 1,750. So 125 more calories than Temple was giving in Madras. So the caloric intake of the relief worker, the people working for famine relief, was less than that of a Nazi concentration camp 100 years later.
That's wild. I'm just trying to take in all the other points of comparison that they put.
I feel like the other points aren't really as important, but yeah.
Well, it's just kind of like, okay, so like, here's what a kid was eating, 7-year-old child, just kind of a normal, like kind of average, nothing. And it's like, it's just like, I don't know, tying in the whole labor aspect of it is, I guess, is what's getting to me. Cause it's like, okay, normal activity, it's just like going about your day, and like, it's just so much significantly more. And then to imagine having to do like heavy labor on that little amount of food is just,
I can't even imagine.
Not to mention, I want to know like what they consider to be like moderate activity for that time, especially considering for like they aren't considering like the humanity of these people, like, you know what I mean? So for them, like they're still considering these people like bipedal machines, right? So I assume their idea of like moderate activity is like the most amount of physical exertion that, like, you know, most people in nobility have ever like done in their lives.
Johnny, do you want to know what Sir Richard Temple did after that?
What?
He completed his cost-saving expeditions to Madras by imposing the Anti-Charitable Contributions Act of 1877, which prohibited, at the pain of imprisonment, private relief donations that potentially interfered with the market fixing of grain prices. They passed an act called the Anti-Charitable Contributions Act of 1877.
It's like literally in the name. Like, you can't be more cartoonishly evil than that.
In this act, by threat of imprisonment, private relief donations that could interfere with market prices of grain would be prohibited.
It literally sounds like some shit made up for like Veep or something, with like a character with like twirling a mustache being like
this is an interesting part of this. Jails, meaning like the literal jails that you would go to if you committed a crime, ironically, were the only exception to this institutional mortality pattern, and they were generally preferred by the poor to the disease-ridden relief camps. An American missionary described how a group of weavers begged him to have them arrested for non-fulfillment of a contract. "We are very sorry, sir, but we have eaten up all the money you gave us, and we have made no clothes. We are in starving condition, and if you will only send us to jail, we shall get something to eat." It was an eminently sensible request. This is a quote: "Prisoners were the best fed poor people in the country, and accordingly the jails were filled to overflowing." So literally you could get more food as someone in jail, as an inmate, than you would at these famine relief camps.
that is
Yeah, I mean, what is
Also,
so fucked.
and also, as you can imagine, a bunch of starving people with very low immune systems, these relief camps became like breeding grounds for diseases, and Temple's ferocious response to reports of mass mortality in the camps was to blame the victims. The infatuation of these poor people in respect to eating the bread of idleness, their dread of marching on command to any distance from home, their preference often for extreme privation rather than submission to even simple and reasonable orders, can be fully believed only by those who have seen or personally known these things. They eat the bread of idleness. Have you ever heard such a thing?
they're getting fat on being lazy?
Yeah, exactly.
Sir, I don't think that analogy works, because it's like bread gives you calories.
Yeah.
These people are starving to death.
And then he even says their dread of marching on command to any distance from home. Like essentially being like, oh, they're being little babies about walking places, which, like, I don't know if they had to walk like 10 miles in famine conditions to get to like this like fucked up disease-ridden relief work camp. And like, he's like,
I assume this dude, just like because he's English, right? And because, like, you know, it's a drought and it's hot in India, right? That like the guy fanning him just constantly like dies. So he's just like, again, get another fan boy.
Right, like, get me a more robust fan child.
Give me another. It's too hot. It's too hot in this horrid country.
And he also said that nor will many be inclined to grieve much for the fate they brought upon themselves, and which terminated lives of idleness and too often of crime. They were also criminals, is what he's saying.
Remember, right, dear listener, right, that what is it? The estimated 19 to 30 million people are starving to death and dying throughout all of this.
Yeah, but why don't they feel like working?
Why aren't they marching?
Why are they tired? Why could they be tired? I know they only get 1,600 calories per day, and they work really hard in doing forced labor because we're forcing them to do it. But why are they so tired?
Yeah,
They're
why
getting
are
like
they-
the equivalent of like
why are they
2
always-
Cliff Bars a day. Like,
why are they always bitching about it? Like, is what I don't get.
They don't have clean
Also,
water, but
for the thing, like 3.9 million Ukrainians died during the Holodomor. So like, you know what I mean? Like just to, not even to like compare them, but just saying like, think about how like, you know, we understand that as like this really epic tragedy and things like
yeah,
that.
how often are you hearing Indian people or Desi people complaining about the millions of
They probably do complain about it.
yeah, they do.
I
And
was
call
making a
this guy-
really horrific joke right now. But like,
They call this guy Nero. But yeah, so and just to finish this out, in Madras City, overwhelmed by 100,000 drought refugees, famished peasants dropped dead in front of the troops guarding pyramids of imported rice. While, this is a quote, on any day and every day, mothers might be seen in the streets offering their children for sale. Philbo, if you want to bring up the next one, I think it's number 16, the estimates of famine mortality. So this is just here in in a couple cities, I believe here. Like you can see the percentage of decline goes from 24,000 to 15,000. It's a decline of 36% of that city's population. And then the next one is 48%. And then it also shows the cattle as well. 67 and 84% decline in cattle in those two regions. So it just goes to show how widespread it was. And like, obviously also they rely on the cattle for their agricultural purposes. So that's part of the, endemic conditions as well.
not to mention this is like prior to you know, like the split up, right, of India and Pakistan, right? But like, you know, within Hindu communities, like cows are not to be killed for food. You for a lot of them cannot eat beef.
Right. So we just got a couple more things here. I think we're about to close it out. I just kind of want to touch on a couple additional things here. This is what one British official recalled seeing in Mysore. The dead and dying were laying about on all sides. Cholera patients rolling about in the midst of persons free of the disease. For shelter, some had crawled to the graves of an adjoining cemetery and had lain themselves between two graves as support for their wearied limbs. The crows were hovering above bodies that still had a spark of life in them. The place seemed tenanted by none but the dead and the dying. In a few minutes, I picked up 5 bodies, one being that of an infant which its dying mother had firmly clasped, ignorant of the child being no more. The cholera patients were lying about unheeded by those around. Some poor children were crying pitilessly for water within the hearing of cooks who never stirred to wet the lips of the poor things that they were in extremis. I assume he means British chefs. I'm not sure. But yeah. And then obviously, you know, that causes a great amount of civil unrest by the summer of 1877 as the famine in Mysore approached its terrible pinnacle. Social order was preserved only by terror. When desperate women and their hungry children, for example, attempted to steal from gardens or glean grain from fields, they were branded, tortured, had their noses cut off, and were sometimes killed.
Oh,
one madman dug up and devoured part of a cholera victim, while another killed his son and ate part of the boy. Meanwhile, Leighton said, "You never saw such popular picnics as they are. The people in them do no work of any kind. They are bursting with fat and naturally enjoy themselves thoroughly. The Duke visits these camps like a Buckingham squire would visit his model farm, taking the deepest interest in the growing fatness of his prize oxen and pigs. But the terrible question is how the Madras government is ever to get these demoralized masses onto really useful work."
it's so evil. Like I don't know. Like I don't know how else to describe it. Like straight up. Like
it's cartoonishly evil. Like it's just
Yeah.
like this is if this would be lazy writing for any fantasy show.
Yeah, and here's more. This is from one of the missionaries. This is from a Christian.
There's more.
Yeah, this is from one of the Christian missionaries. Recently, the corpse of a woman was carried along the road, slung to a pole like an animal, with the face partly devoured by dogs. The other day, a famished, crazy woman took a dead dog and ate it near our bungalow. This is not sensational writing, emphasized the Anglican correspondent. The half of the horrors of this famine have not and cannot be told. Men do not care to reproduce in writing scenes which have made their blood run cold.
Yeah.
Yeah. This whole thing just sounds. It's so fucked.
Well, and then
series, right?
Temple went on to order his district officers and engineers to discourage relief works in every possible way. Yeah, when starving peasants fought back, there was and to their credit, the people of India, there was 150 grain riots in August and September of 1877. So 150 riots for grain, but they just pretty much, it says here that they filled the jails and the prisons.
Just wild.
Yeah.
It's all just
Go
for
ahead.
profits. Like, it's all just for making money. Like, this is no other, this is the only reason. And racism.
Well, Leighton blamed the horrendous mortality more on the unwillingness of the people to leave their homes than by any want of forethought on the part of local government in providing works where they might be relieved. So he just goes on to say more and more that it's really just them being lazy more than anything else.
It's not us. We're not doing anything.
So I have a quote here by actually the last portion of this chapter is called Famine and Nationalism. And I didn't take a whole lot from it, but there is one part of this that I think that we can use as like an ending quote for this discussion, because we've gone on pretty long here and we're going to try to work on that. You know what I mean? Get this more and more, fine tuned for everyone. But there's an Indian nationalist that, because like it was kind of talking about how the famine and what the British did kind of started to fuel Indian nationalism, like fuel like a resistance to like the colonialism, like, and maybe that this was like the foundation for what would come for Indian independence decades later. But he said, how strange is it that British rulers do not see that they themselves are the main cause of the destruction that ensues from droughts, that it is the drain of India's wealth by them that lays at their own door the dreadful results of misery, starvation, and deaths of millions. Why blame poor nature when the fault lies at your own door? You know what I mean? Because it's all just, oh, nature did this. You know, this is all just, a natural occurrence. So really what we're talking about here is like, it's not about either or. It's not about nature, and it's not just about like economics necessarily, but it's about what has changed in the economic and political systems of these places that they can no longer sustain famines. Because there's been times where they had droughts before, but the thing is that they have grain stores and they have abilities to help each other. They don't have this rigid idea of, capitalism and Malthusian and, laissez-faire things where it's like you can't help people. And now it's like you see people dying by the tens of millions. And what's the new variable? And it's this variable of, free market orthodoxy.
And on top of just like the natural El Nino cycles, which is like something that is happening kind of in the background. And like you said, it's, these cultures have been able to, weather these types of storms or global climate patterns in the past. But what, changed it is the capitalist commodification of the land and of the products from the land. And to kind of drill deeper into that is like and how that affects like the local environments to make it less drought resistance is like that monocropping is very intensive on the soil. And when you break up these, natural ecosystems that have like a deep developed soil that holds a lot of water, that is like kind of, it becomes like a water storage bank in the total ecology that, helps plants get through, maybe a particularly dry year. But if you break up that soil, you dry it out, you lose all that structure, which is, just a huge sponge. And then, and so that exacerbates these problems that, and it is a cultural shift from, the traditional ways of subsistence farming that they had to like this commodity production agriculture. And that further exacerbated, this horrendous situation.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that was a great, concise statement on that. Johnny?
Yeah, I have a feeling that we're going to walk away from this book with like and understanding that like a lot of what's happening right, even right now in the world in terms of like, you know, climate change and whatnot, is that one of the primary things that we can be doing to like maybe not reverse entirely like the effects of like the Industrial Revolution, but what we can do to at least stall a lot of what's happening. And I think we got like a glimpse of that during COVID, is that like the way that we are, you know, in this purely profit motive oriented extractive process of using the resources of the earth, right, is just not tenable. It is untenable. It is, you know, completely, you know, damaging, not just to like the earth itself, but even to the people that exist on the earth. And that like we need some other way, some other means. And I think that like when we see these heightened examples, right, of colonialism, these heightened examples of the effects of capitalism, right, like, you know, in its most bare bones form, without all the PR, public relations, and propaganda surrounding it, right, we see like the true human toll that it can have, along with, you know, maybe some ecological example.
Well, and not only that, we're just starting the book. So like if anybody says like, oh,
Yeah.
you believe in socialism, what about the 100 million dead? Like, it's like, dude, like I know like between a 20-year period where like apparently like 200 million people died as we
Right.
forced them into capitalist mode of production. So
Yeah.
it's like, you know what I mean? Like at the very best, they cancel each other out and you can't even use that as an argument.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I'm very excited to continue going down the path of going through this book with you guys and discussing it, and whoever else is watching this. And, you know, if you're coming along this ride with us, I'm very excited to be doing it with you as well. This is our first episode for the podcast. I hope it went well. We're going to try to fine tune more things and streamline it to make sure that it's as efficient and, you know, digestible as possible. So we'll continue working on that. We plugged everything at the front of this, right? We don't have to do like a bunch of plugs right now. They're not listening, but nobody's listening at this point anyway. Nobody made it to the very end anyway. So get all those plugs out. Get all those plugs out in the beginning. We'll be back next week and we'll be going through, I don't know, maybe the next 2 or so chapters of this. But stay tuned. It'll be out soon.
So, lal salam, all our Habibis, Habibtis, neither and in-betweenies. Stay strong out there. We'll see you soon.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
So don't run around here trying to make friends with somebody who's depriving you of your rights. They're not your friends. No, they're your enemies. And treat them like that and fight them, and you'll get your freedom. My repertoire is USSR. P.L.O. style, P.L.O. style got thrown out the car. Rise for subversive plots. They'll call you an extremist or subversive or red radical. Rise for subversive plots. Red radical. And fight them. Capitalism and democracy. Capitalism and democracy are not synonymous. We group us up like ants in a colony. Organize the wealth into a socialist economy. A way of life based off the common needs. And all my comrades is ready, we just spreading the seed. And all my comrades is ready, we just spreading the seed. And all my comrades is ready, we just spreading the seed.